Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the PsyFi series, discovering the cutting-edge science and research in psychedelic medicine.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the PsyFi podcast, where we speak to leading industry experts, clinicians, researchers, and scientists to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic science. Today, I'm really excited for our episode. I'm joined by Dr. Jeremy Weate of Universal Ibogaine. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Gaurav. Glad to be here.
You had a really dynamic presentation at our last Psychedelic Capital. I really enjoyed it. For the people who might not be familiar with you yet, could you just introduce yourself and a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jeremy. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Universal Ibogaine. Been on the job since June this year. Been on the board of Universal Ibogaine since February. Universal Ibogaine will be the company that medicalizes Ibogaine and makes Ibogaine-assisted therapy available en masse around the world, beginning with Canada. We're taking Ibogaine through clinical trials with Health Canada, putting the application in first quarter next year. And we hope that within the next 3 to 4 years, we'll have full approval from Health Canada for medical Ibogaine for all that need it, if not sooner than that. Obviously, there's a huge crisis with opioid addiction in North America and other parts of the world. And it's just the case that Ibogaine is the only molecule that can most effectively stop withdrawals and ensure a rapid detox. So it's really, really needed medicine. Unlike other molecules which are put through drug development, we know Ibogaine is safe. We know Ibogaine works. But of course, we appreciate the fact that it does have to go through clinical trials. So, we're looking forward to that. And at the same time, we're opening a first Ibogaine clinic in Nassau, the Bahamas, in Q1 next year as well. So we'll also be a revenue business from early next year.
Wow, that's super exciting. You have a lot of really cool things on the horizon, and we're going to have a really great discussion about Ibogaine, and it's going to get really nerdy sometimes. And I look forward to that, talking about BDNF and GDNF and just some of the neurotropic factors that this kind of modulates. But before we dive into all of that, if you could just give us, a basic understanding of what Ibogaine is, and the plant it comes from, and you talked a little bit about its context, but that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ibogaine is a plant-derived molecule. The main source or the traditional source of Ibogaine is from a shrub called Tabernanthe iboga. And Tabernanthe iboga is distributed across the Congo basin. There is a sister species called Tabernanthe elliptica, which is found mostly south of the Congo River. And Tabernanthe iboga is mostly distributed north. Ibogaine can also be extracted from many other plants, at least 30 other plants from around the world. In the traditional context, mostly in Gabon, it's used as part of an initiation rite called Weate. I've been initiated into Weate myself, and it's very much like a sort of African bar mitzvah. It's a coming of age ceremony, marking the passage from sort of childhood into adulthood. Ibogaine has a fascinating history outside of Africa and Gabon. It was first isolated, the molecule, in early 20th century in France by Dybowski. And there was a lot of research done in the French context. And it was actually used as a muscle stimulant tonic called Lamborghini from the 1930s to around the 1960s in France. So it was sort of like an athletic stimulant. And then we flipped to America, and it was used under the MK Ultra CIA program, Lexington Addiction Clinic in the 50s. The doctor in charge, Harris Isbell, is quite a notorious figure in that program. And then in sort of civilian life, it was discovered by accident. Its anti-addictive properties were discovered by accident by a 19-year-old from New York called Howard Lotsoff, who's sort of like the granddaddy of Ibogaine in the West. He was very much a beatnik, experimental type guy, and he discovered that his heroin addiction had disappeared pretty much overnight by taking Ibogaine. And So he sort of shared it among his experimental friends, and then he sort of forgot about it and went on to study film. And it was only in the 80s that his interest in Ibogaine was reawakened. And then he spent, the last sort of 30 years of his life from the 80s to his death in around 2010, really, really pushing for medicalization of Ibogaine. He teamed up with Professor Deborah Mash, who's still among us. She's a sort of emeritus professor at the University of Miami. And she was the person who amazingly managed to get approval for FDA approval for clinical trials for Ibogaine back in the 90s. Unfortunately, she only got partway through the clinical trials for phase 1. And then she hit a funding barrier, and NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Addiction, withdrew its funding support. And then what happened with Ibogaine was it went underground, basically. And, Dr. Mash went on to set up a clinic in St. Kitts, and an Ibogaine scene began to emerge in the 90s and in the 2000s in Mexico. And to this day, Ibogaine has a thriving gray zone status in Mexico. It's an unregulated molecule. So there's at least 30 clinics in Mexico, probably significantly more. Most of them are just south of the border of San Diego in the Tijuana, Rosarito Beach area. But there's clinics across the world, in Europe, in Russia, in Asia, and so on. So, there's many thousands of people that actually take Ibogaine at the moment who find out about it and, go to a clinic. But unfortunately, because there isn't a clinic in the world that's fully regulated and government approved, you're kind of taking a bit of potluck whether you find a proper medically assisted clinic or, more of a backstreet operation. It's really important. One of the things I'll say, Gaurav, is that while I really welcome the decriminalization movement, of course, psychedelics and in fact all drugs should not be criminalized. Ibogaine is a little bit different, or significantly different from, say, psilocybin or LSD, in that it really does require a medical program, a medicalization of pre-treatment screening for your liver function, your heart function, and psychological assessment. And then while you're in clinic taking the Ibogaine, you need to be hooked up to an EKG, and you need to have eyes on the EKG, and there needs to be ACLS trained nurses and doctors. It's an emergency procedure. And in that context, Ibogaine will pretty much always be safe. We have Dr. Alberto Sola on our board. He runs a Clear Sky clinic in Cancun. He's had nearly 4,000 patients and nobody's died. So I would say, Gaurav, that while there is a sort of sheen of an issue around the cardiotoxicity of Ibogaine, and certainly it does slow the heart rate down, certainly there is a risk of arrhythmia, worst case scenario, torsade de pointe, which is pretty much when your heart, the arrhythmias spiral out of control. All of those things are perfectly controllable in a medical environment. If you've got a trained doctor and trained cardiac nurses, is absolutely not a problem with Ibogaine safety. The other thing, without blabbing on too much, Gaurav, the other thing, and
we'll go ahead.
Well, the other thing that I'd like to say is that, there's a chemist friend of mine, a very, very bright young man, and he's been studying the molecule for a few years now. And he says that when it comes to Ibogaine, pharmacologically, it's like staring into the abyss because it is an incredible molecule. Classical psychedelics are called classical psychedelics because they activate the serotonin receptor, 5-HT2A receptor. Ibogaine has some activation on that receptor site, but it's also targeting multiple receptor sites. An NMDA receptor, it blocks a little bit like, or a lot like ketamine. The sigma receptors, nicotinic receptors, the three key opioid receptors of mu, kappa, and delta, which is why its sweet spot is interrupting opiate-based addictions. So it's really like plugging on an EEG hat and doing things with multiple receptor sites, which themselves internally relate to each other in a way that's more or less beyond contemporary neuroscience to fully understand. So in pharmacological circles, the pharmacokinetics and the mechanism of action of Ibogaine is not fully understood. And it's fair to say there's competing theories about what's actually happening with Ibogaine. So, yeah, it is an incredible molecule. It does perform pretty much a full central nervous system reset if at appropriate doses. It gives you incredible new brain plasticity and an opportunity for a new life. Ibogaine metabolizes, and this is the work of Professor Mash again. Its primary metabolite is called noribogaine, and noribogaine remains within the system for many weeks, basically, and it effectively functions as a slow-release endogenous microdose system for the body. And so it's really, really good post-Ibogaine to go through, different forms of therapy, whether it's more the CBT to, recalibrate habitual responses to stimuli, or more holistic forms of therapy, narrative therapy, and so on, because you do have this vital 3 to 4 months window of opportunity while the noribogaine is still on board to modulate your relationship to the world and your relationships with other people and, where you are in the world and so on. So, like the reality check for Ibogaine is that if you don't complement it with pre-treatment therapy and aftercare, it will give you a good shot at an abstinence-free life, but it is common for people to relapse after Ibogaine if it's just the molecule. So, at Universal Ibogaine, we're very focused on a holistic service offering, which, in the pre-treatment phase sets you up for your treatment, to have respect for the process and to be prepared to make some significant changes in your life and all the rest of it. And then immediately post-treatment to support that recalibration of relationship to people, to places, to yourself, and so on.
Wow, yeah, you brought up so many fascinating things that I want to touch on and talk about to give people a little bit of an idea of how important this is and the demographic of people you're treating. Because of its ability to significantly attenuate, if not completely alleviate, acute opiate withdrawal. People on drugs like heroin and oxycodone, Norco. I mean, they're coming to use Ibogaine to be able to get through that withdrawal, but also set themselves up for a successful recovery. And I think that's so fascinating because and so important right now because the opioid epidemic is really raging. And so what you're doing comes at an important time, and you're right. Ibogaine is very safe when used in a safe context. And from my understanding, the heart issues and things of that nature can be avoided with proper pre-screening and the EKG, like you talked about. So I think it's really the landscape of opioid addiction is also changing so rapidly too. There's a lot more fentanyl. There's fentanyl analogs in the drugs now, and that's changing how important it is for you guys to detox patients before, stabilize them before they get the treatment. And then they get this medicine. It does this remarkable thing over the next 8 to 12 or however many hours, to where they come out of it and they're not in acute withdrawal. And so, and they are in this place of increased plasticity. So I think this would be a good segue into maybe how is your understanding of, what is your understanding of how this happens, in the brain on a neuropharmacological level? I know we're still figuring it out, but it would be interesting to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so there isn't, a conclusive answer to that. Clearly, because it's resetting the opioid receptors, and I believe the kappa opioid receptor is the key one that it resets. That is, that's giving you a fighting chance of, having an unimpaired opioid endogenous receptor system. The NMDA, I think, is really important, and I think what's going to emerge, Gaurav, is there'll be a sympathy or synergy between ketamine treatment and Ibogaine treatment. And I think this is very, very cutting edge. So basically the ketamine experience, for a mainstream population who, may not be that into going for a trip, ketamine is an incredible opening because it's pretty safe. It lasts, less than an hour. It's not too an intense an experience at low dose, which is typically the doses that are often offered at good ketamine clinics. but it dampens down NMDA glutamate receptor activity. Now, to my understanding, not being a neuroscientist, but reading the literature as best I can, we don't fully understand, and I stand to be corrected, but we don't understand how there's this paradoxical relationship between closing down the glutamate receptor, the NMDA receptor, and at the same time increased neural activity. Because the NMDA receptor usually switches on and activates neural activity. So why switching it down leads to increased neuronal activity, we don't understand, but that's definitely part of why ketamine works. And it's solidly in the matrix of understanding of why Ibogaine works, is that it does reactivate brain circuitry. Related to that, I suspect, and I'm on thin ice because I'm not a neuroscientist, but one of the other competing theories about the mechanism of action of Ibogaine has been postulated by a Slovenian guy called Roman Pasculin. And he's looked at in vitro studies of injecting Ibogaine into tissues and in vitro. And what he's found is that Ibogaine stimulates the production of ATP, which is the mitochondrial cellular energy system. So this is, to my understanding, completely outside of any neuronal receptor activation, whether agonizing or antagonizing. It's actually increasing cellular energy. What does that do in terms of input and a change to the central nervous system? And his research is very much around the gene expression switching that happens through Ibogaine and through this process of increasing ATP cellular energy. So there's a competing way into the effects of Ibogaine. And I think the thing that is most interesting of all is this glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically a form of growth factor in the brain. One way of understanding the role of GDNF is it's helper cells which come to repair brain damage. And in this case, what happens with the production of GDNF is a consequence of that is there's new dopamine cells which are sprouted within the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, which is in the kind of near the cerebellum, and then they get expressed through the rest of the brain. So, in simple terms, you're getting brand new dopamine circuitry expressed through the brain, through the kind of engine house of the cerebellum, the VTA. And so having, basically a new dopamine reward system circuitry, so you get reset to that. So I think, the multi-target brain receptors, the increase in cellular energy, and the production of GDNF, they may all be true, and they're working synergistically with each other. But it just shows you how complex Ibogaine is, that, some of the more recent studies on GDNF are a year old, maximum 2 years old. I think the other thing about GDNF and Ibogaine is the potential for addressing neurodegenerative disorders. So there's some very interesting work being done at Stanford on Ibogaine and traumatic brain injury and PTSD. So a bit like MDMA with MAPS, there may well be an application for military veterans and people that have had other kinds of brain injury. And also looking obviously at Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So there is some initial preclinical work being done, sort of anecdotally, with people with Parkinson's. And what we know so far is that the standard medicine for Parkinson's, which is called Sinemet, when you introduce Ibogaine, it increases the effectivity, if you like, or the efficacy of Sinemet. So Sinemet, when you first take it, if you have Parkinson's disease, to my understanding, Gaurav, is it works, and you're kind of, you have a bit more activity, sort of motor activity and all the rest of it, which is obviously affected negatively by Parkinson's. But then the Sinemet stops working after time. And Ibogaine, from what little we know of introducing Ibogaine to various people with Parkinson's, is it seems to reactivate the efficacy of the Sinemet. So working, hand in hand with the Sinemet. So yeah, we're at the very beginnings. Addiction treatment is the primary application that we're focused on at Universal Ibogaine, but I can well imagine that in the next few years we'll see Ibogaine's value for central nervous reset. Certainly one of the things people have been talking about is the long COVID and the central nervous system damage that some people have. Ibogaine in a microdose form may be a candidate application for that. None of this is to say that in the future and in the fullness of time, Gaurav, an analog of Ibogaine may take over from Ibogaine, which is less cardiotoxic. I don't want to romanticize Ibogaine. There is an importance to drug development and research, and we'll certainly be there. If there is a less cardiotoxic analog to Ibogaine, we'll be all for it. But having said that, I do sort of like the fact that it is plant derived, and the Ibogaine that we'll be using for our clinical trials will come from Vocanga africana, which is a tree which is more widely distributed around the world than Tabernanthe iboga. It's perfectly sustainable. So yeah, I do like the link to the plant derived base of Ibogaine at the moment, but I'm sanguine enough to accept that ultimately it will likely be replaced by probably a fully synthesized version that's made in the lab.
Yeah, you could have fooled me about not being a neuroscientist, man. That's awesome. So many fascinating things. I really like the parallel neuropharmacologically between ketamine and Ibogaine that you drew. I didn't know about that, so that's interesting. Although I can kind of see that now that you talk about it, and I have heard about its NMDA activity. So that's really interesting that they can maybe be used in a together in some sort of fashion or for treatment. I think ketamine has really been like the Trojan horse for psychedelics,
Exactly.
And it's really interesting because the mechanism of how it works, Dr. Jeffrey Becker of Bexon, they're developing some interesting ketamine therapeutics, described it with like a laminar flow analogy, to where like the traditional psychedelics will kind of increase that pressure, whereas like ketamine's kind of like still producing that sort of psychedelic experience, but in a backwards kind of way without causing the anxiety that traditional psychedelics sort of cause. And I think it's so interesting because Ibogaine is not considered a traditional psychedelic. It's considered a dream inducer. In fact, it's got another term. I can't remember it off the top of my head. Oniodesteron or something like that.
Or neurogenic.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
From the ancient Greek oneros, for the ancient Greek word for dreams, or neurogenic. Or remogenic is, some of the French research. There was a guy, was it Raymond Gutturel, prominent French researcher of Ibogaine, who he had an early mechanism of action theory, which was that Ibogaine induces rememesis, so rapid eye movement, dreamlike. So he called it remogenic as well. Quite what he meant in terms of that being an explanation for the mechanism of action, I'm not sure, but I guess the idea is that REM sleep is generally important to us in terms of resetting the brain overnight in some way, in terms of a lowered brain frequency and all the rest of it. So I imagine that Gutturel's idea was, look, it's extending that rememetic period to allow for the brain to refresh itself and in a longer term way.
That's really interesting. And we're talking about BDNF or GDNF, but we know that these affect the architecture and the actual structure of the brain, and to our understanding, the traditional antidepressants act on BDNF over time and are thought to cause positive structural changes. So it's so interesting that Ibogaine is shown to act on these molecules and so rapidly, right? I think that's like a really important thing, especially when it comes to opioid addiction in general, right? Because the addict's mindset is instant gratification and wanting to feel better quickly, and that's especially understandable when you're in the throes of opiate withdrawal. Because for the people that don't know what that's like, it's pretty horrific. The best way I've heard it described is, first you're afraid you're going to die, and then you're afraid you're not going to die.
Yeah.
So it's really crazy that the Ibogaine enters the someone's system when they're in withdrawal, and it takes that withdrawal away. And maybe it's through its opiate activity, even though it doesn't stimulate the opiate receptors like an opiate does, or it's like NMDA activity, and it kind of, whatever the case may be, the patient gets comfortable rather quickly. And then when the experience is over, they don't go back into withdrawal for the most part, unless they're on something like methadone or Suboxone, which is a little longer, because of the longer half-life. It's a different thing to approach, but just to give people an idea of how remarkable that process is, it's really important.
I don't want to oversell it as well, especially if you have a long-acting opiate addiction, like you're on buprenorphine. Buprenorphine stays in the system for weeks. It's got a very long half-life. And I think one of the things we're learning is that you probably need to switch over to a short-acting opiate like morphine sulfate for many weeks in advance of your Ibogaine treatment. And I think this is where our protocol will evolve across time, but we're learning more that you need to have no buprenorphine in your system when you do Ibogaine. The other thing to say is, if people watching this are suffering from some kind of opiate or opioid addiction, it's an unpleasant experience doing Ibogaine. With psilocybin, it can be lovely and spiritual and divine, and dark material, shadow material can come up, but it's all good. Same with ayahuasca. With Ibogaine, it's a much heavier duty experience. So, you can very typically experience ataxia, which is basically you can't move your body. You need to be helped to go to the bathroom. You're puking up. You're dizzy when you open your eyes. So it's, and then post the Ibogaine experience, especially for people, coming from the opiate or opioid addiction background, you can feel like you're still in withdrawal, even though you're not, and what's happening there is because you're, so much brain receptors have been refreshed and reactivated and are back to a pre-addicted state. You're feeling the body like you haven't felt the body for years. If you've been hooked on heroin for years, you're just in this kind of sedated state where you're not feeling the pain of your body. Post Ibogaine, all of that's coming back. So that while Ibogaine is also an analgesic, amongst many other things, once the Ibogaine has worn off and you're just on the nor-Ibogaine, you're back to being a normal human being with aches and pains. And so, I helped set up a clinic in Portugal, Tabula Rasa, a few years ago. And, seeing people, hooked on heroin come through and then moaning about restless leg syndrome and feeling really uncomfortable for days after the Ibogaine. So it's a rapid detox like nothing else, but it is a difficult process. And in a way, Gaurav, that flips us back to the pre-treatment therapy side of things. The key thing about pre-treatment therapy is to really gear yourself up to run up that mountain. As someone we both know, Anders says, it's the hero's journey. It's like you've got to take a run and jump, and you've got to keep going and not give in, and realize, that there's a pot of gold at the other side of the rainbow. It's really important that you're mentally strong and mentally tough to push through the days after Ibogaine. The first day after the Ibogaine for people, heroin, opioid addicts is called the gray day. You just feel like shit. Everything is just, nothing is working, nothing is right. So that day, it's really important to realize that's normal. It's part of it. You're fine. Everything's going to be great. The following day will be better. The following day will be better. You will get through it. So it's really, I've come in my time being fascinated and somewhat obsessed with Ibogaine. It's a key tool in the process, but there's many other steps to that process. You can't avoid that, especially if you've got the opioid addiction, but there's many other steps in the journey before and beyond it.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned all of those things and you spotlighted the importance of the other factors in the process. I think it's dangerous to sell the idea that it's a magic bullet, because addiction is really something that takes a consistent effort, and dedication, discipline really tackle. And these psychedelics can really be, and Ibogaine in particular for opioid addiction, such powerful catalysts in that process. But they're still part of a larger process, you know. So you brought up some good points, particularly the feeling of pain afterwards, you know, and the just feeling of your emotions and sensations. For the people that, do you have patients that come through that have chronic pain, and how do you advise them to deal with that after the Ibogaine treatment? That's got to be a tricky thing, I'm sure.
Yeah, there is a class of people that are dealing with chronic pain. One of the emerging areas I think that's going to be increasingly important for us is looking at the world of elite sports. You know, whether it's hockey, American football, basketball. There is a kind of hidden epidemic of opioid pain relief, which is basically almost required for you to stay in the game and stay professional and stay being an asset for the team. You pop the pills basically and just push through the pain. So there's a sort of dark side to professional sports, which you know, there is a lot of addiction to you know, OxyContin and all the rest of it. And so while Ibogaine does reset you and get you off them, there is still often the underlying issue of how to deal with the residual pain. You know, I've had people come through for treatment in Portugal. Just a guy fell off a ladder, you know, had a back injury and so on. So dealing with post-treatment chronic pain is absolutely key. I would say I don't have a full answer, but I would say that the answer is going to be either some kind of CBD or cannabinoid treatment, or it's going to be along the lines of ketamine. I know ketamine, you know, ketamine implants and patches are in the works. So, yeah, dealing with chronic pain will be, you know, over to sister psychedelics or quasi psychedelics like those two, and possibly CBD, CBG, CBN, whatever the CB combination is, will be, you know, one of the solution pathways to dealing with chronic pain.
That's really important and interesting that you bring those points up. You know, I think it'd be cool to go backwards a little bit into your life a little more. What got you interested in Ibogaine, and you know, to where you are today? Like, what kind of inspired you to take this journey?
Yeah, so as I've said before, it was a conversation on a London bus, probably more than a decade ago, where a friend of mine, Nick, mentioned, have you heard, you know, we were talking about psychedelics and our experiences, and he said, have you heard of Iboga? And I hadn't. And as soon as I found out it was from Africa, I'd been living in Africa for many years, probably 15 years I've lived in different parts of Africa. And across the time living on the continent, I got really sick of people being, you know, sort of negative about Africa and like just treating it as like a monolithic block of suffering, HIV, and you know, when you're on the ground anywhere in the world, you quickly realize, you know, the magic and the fact that there's good people everywhere and incredible cultures everywhere, and that's what I found in my experience in different African countries. And anyway, long story short, Gaurav, as soon as I heard that in Gabon, there's this tradition called Weate, and it goes back hundreds of years, and through the Pygmies, thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. You know, they found Iboga in cave systems in Gabon. I, of course, wanted to know more, and that's what eventually led me to do an initiation in Gabon at Ebando 4 or so years ago. And yeah, you know, when you go through that experience of going to Gabon, and, you know, the 10 days of ever more intense ritual preparation for the Iboga ceremony, and then you go through the Iboga ceremony. I remember the 24 hours after the conclusion of my Iboga ceremony. So, you know, it starts around 11 o'clock and goes on till maybe 12 hours. And then 24 hours after that, I was awake at 4 a.m. and it started raining for about 10 minutes. And Tatayo, who's this wizened old French guy that runs Ebanda, is an amazing human being. He said, "Yeah, it was a good ceremony. It always rains when it's you know, it's been a good ceremony, and it's right by the beach." And anyway, you go through that set of experiences, and it's sort of like you have an umbilical connection to Gabon and the culture there, and the fact that it's under threat. The demand globally for Iboga has pushed up the prices locally. So, there's tragic situations where people are substituting Iboga for alcohol. And, I will always want to help. And with Universal Ibogaine, we will always try to support, whether or not our Ibogaine is sourced from Tabananthi Iboga, and it likely will never be. It will always be important to support Gabon and, keep this amazing culture and tradition going, basically, because it is the source culture. My experience there, maybe I got 0.1% of wisdom from that, because it's so complex. It's, again, like I've said before, it's like going to a Tibetan monastery for a few weeks. I mean, how much are you gonna scratch of the surface of being in a Tibetan, spiritual culture for a few weeks? Probably a little bit, but compared to the sum corpus of knowledge. I also remember the shaman figure who was leading my ceremony. He was speaking very rapid French. I could pick up some of it, but not all of it. And one of the things he said that stuck with me, Gaurav, was, Weate and Iboga, it's not book knowledge. You can't just read up on Iboga and then somehow think you're an expert. It's something that you do with your body through practice across time. So again, it's not this kind of textual Western way, cognitive, information that you somehow download. You have to serve, if you're going to be, working as a shaman in the Weate context, you're going to have to spend 10 years apprenticeship minimum. And even then you're just at the entry level of, kind of the priesthood effectively. So it's a working body and a working tradition, with deep spiritual knowledge. And again, I think the link with Tibet is of interest because, with Tibetan Buddhism and the Bon tradition that comes before it, there's a pretty intense mapping of the post-death state, the Bardo states. There's a whole sort of understanding and mapping of the post-death states. And again, with Weate, it's very much about going into the ancestral realm, passing the veil into the death realm and so on. So, who knows? I think at a very deep human spiritual level, the Tibetan Buddhism and Weate are somehow spiritually one or entwined with each other.
Yeah, it comes from these plant medicines. So many of them, they come from such rich cultures, and the indigenous people and the people of those tribes that have carried these traditions and brought them forward have so much to teach us. And it's so interesting because, we're trying to figure out in this psychedelic renaissance, how are we going to train our clinicians properly to administer this medicine? What are the best pre-treatment and post-treatment therapy modalities look like? We're trying to figure all these things out, and I keep seeing that we can just turn to the cultures that these medicines came from, and how did they train the people that administered the Iboga? They didn't just, it wasn't just anyone, like you were just talking about. It took a lot of years of training, and they didn't just give them Iboga. It was part of this ritual and ceremony that was so deeply spiritual, and it just had really deep roots in their cultures and their tradition. And it's often talked about that the Weate tribe, they don't have a word for addiction, or depression. That those two words don't exist in their lexicon, which I think is so fascinating. And so, I think you should talk a little bit about that and how we can go turn to the witch holes and learn about peyote and the best way to utilize that. And then you brought up a really good point about sustainability too, and taking it not from the Tabernacle Iboga, which I thought was a really, really mindful and conscious way to approach this.
Yeah, no. This is the juicy bit of this whole thing, and it doesn't feel like work, basically. So one of the things we're working on, Gaurav, at the moment is we've started a private seminar series, if you like. There's a lot of psychedelic conferences. You guys put on the best, of course, microdose, but there is not so much a space for holistic practitioners interested in psychedelics to talk outside of a conference, sort of showing off. So last week we kicked off and we had a group of 12 people on a call. And what we're talking about there is not directly programmatically relevant to what Universal Ibogaine does. It's much more, look, let's kick off a conversation about traditional Indigenous healing practices. In this case specifically, we're starting with Canada and First Nations, and let's look at how those holistic practices, the ones which have fully recovered, the ones which need more work to, fully recover them, how they can be a healing opportunity for people from disadvantaged, marginalized communities like Indigenous communities in North America. So what would it take for healing to be available through Ibogaine and other plant medicines in an Indigenous context? And also, what would it take for those contexts themselves to set up holistic healing businesses for outsiders to come? And there's so many issues involved in that. It's important not to be naive and romantic about all the issues involved, structural poverty, intergenerational and likely epigenetic trauma from, the brute colonialism of the school system, the residential school system, where people were separated from their families, which is very recent memory that it was ended. So introducing Ibogaine and other plant medicines in those contexts needs to be very, very nuanced. It needs to be needs driven, from the people. So we're, as an example, it's baby steps, basically. As an example, there's a prominent lodge in central Canada. I won't name it for now, but there's some very esteemed knowledge keepers in that lodge. Indigenous people from all over the world go there. And, from a Universal Ibogaine perspective, it's like, great, there's this lodge, we can, send off an NDA and do a joint venture and, help them set up a holistic business based on what they do. It doesn't work like that. You've got to come from their perspective. The very first step in working with these people is to go into ceremony with them. And that ceremony will be private and they will call on the ancestors. And anyway, we're up for that. We have Chief Campbell on our board. He's a hereditary chief of the Squamish Nation and also an elected chief. We have other First Nations circling around. And this seminar series is likely to grow so that, we've got a run-up of maybe 3 or 4 years before Ibogaine's available medically in Canada, approved by Health Canada. And by that time, issues like, okay, so if you're going to have holistic healing clinics in different First Nations bands across Canada, and you want to make sure that the people working in those clinics are First Nations people, then there's a whole training, pedagogical aspect which needs to be dealt with. So, yeah, and then just in terms of the aftercare and having a supportive aftercare and making sure that people don't immediately go back to the disadvantaged living circumstances that they have. So we're not naive about this, and we're aware that it's a long conversation. We need to just listen to people, figure out what's already on the ground, what's working, what's not working, and then embed across Canada, in terms of the current harm reduction paradigm. How does Ibogaine insert itself into the harm reduction paradigm? And the final thing there, Gaurav, is that because Ibogaine is Schedule 1 in the US, it may take quite a while to reschedule it and take it out of the sin bin. And of course, there'll be pressure against it anyway. So strategically, what we figure is, look, we set up a chain of Ibogaine detox clinics, either our own or franchised across Canada. Also aftercare, holistic aftercare provision in First Nations, Indigenous settings and non-First Nation settings. And then we have like an infrastructure which will be of benefit for all North Americans. So, at the moment, Americans, find their way south across the border to Mexican clinics, but we'll have the opportunity for Americans to go north to well-regulated, very holistic Ibogaine clinics.
Oh, that's really interesting. As usual, there's so much I want to comment on. The thing that comes to mind right now is when we were talking about sustainability. I need to write this. I had completely lost my train of thought. I'll write this time point down so we can edit this out.
No worries.
What was I going to say? think I want to pick up where you were talking about like the practices that we can take from these tribes and these cultures, and kind of how rich a history it is that they originate from. And it's interesting that you collaborating with the First Nations and setting up the infrastructure to make this possible. Accessibility is what came to mind. A lot of people today, when they think of or they have a desire to do iboga, they generally, especially in the United States, have to travel to another country, and it's not necessarily the cheapest, most affordable treatment for some people. What's your advice to them, and how do you see this becoming more accessible to people in the future, especially if it's going to remain Schedule 1 for a while in the United States?
I can't deny, Gaurav, that we're not going to solve the accessibility issue overnight, and we're at risk of being, a victim of our own success if we raise the awareness of Ibogaine too quickly. Then it may be that there's just not enough bed space that we have for people. So I'm pretty critically aware of that. We're setting up the clinic in the Bahamas next year. There's another Caribbean island that has just legalized psychedelics that we're talking to. We're looking at an Ibogaine aftercare facility across the border from Tijuana for aftercare. But none of this in the short term, ahead of medicalizing in Canada, is going to be able to respond effectively to growing awareness and demand for Ibogaine. So we're going to have a period, and it just is what it is, of 2 to 3 years, however long it takes for Health Canada for us to go through the clinical trial process. And hopefully it can be a lot sooner than 2 or 3 years. Just as to take a sidestep into the clinical trial timeline, we hope to complete the clinical trial application by end of first quarter 2021. We would like to begin enrollment by third quarter 2021 at the latest. We anticipate something like a 20-person phase 2, 2 people per month in the same clinic. So it may take till realistically the end of 2022 to complete phase 2. Then put the clinical trial application in for the final phase, which is multi-site, as you know. We hope that we agree with Health Canada a relatively small cohort size for the phase 3. And that could, if all the ducks are in a row and everything is as efficient as possible, take 18 months. That's probably the most aggressive available timeline. So you're still looking at 2024. So there is this, anyway, to go back to the topic, there is going to be 2 or 3 years of frustration where more people are likely to have heard about Ibogaine, and they simply, they'll probably find themselves going across the border to Mexico. Now, another point I wanted to bring up, Gaurav, was that, decriminalization, while of course it's really important that all drugs, not just psychedelic drugs, are not subject to, the criminal code, the decrim movement in America, from specifically an Ibogaine perspective, does have some risks associated with it. We've seen already, there's a YouTube little clip of a guy checking himself into a hotel. I believe it might be Denver. And there's some random guy sitting on a twin bed in the same room. And there's someone on FaceTime, the provider, and he, pops the Ibogaine, and the guy on FaceTime you can find it on YouTube. And it's rather alarming in the case of Ibogaine that this might be an unintended consequence of decriminalization. So, definitely anybody involved in the decrim movement, kudos to you, amazing work. But specifically for Ibogaine, I worry that, if there's an adverse event or, God forbid, somebody dies in one of these decriminalized zones in America, it might just hamper rescheduling Ibogaine still further. So there's a bit more work to be done in terms of making sure there's a supportive regulatory framework at state level, specifically for Ibogaine provision in decriminalized zones in the States.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's something that we're trying to just collectively, I think, do so much better this time and so much more mindfully than the 60s and 70s in the psychedelic renaissance, is to make sure everything does go as smoothly as possible, and we don't have to undergo more decades of prohibition, because we saw how damaging that was. So yeah, I think it's important to be really mindful, and like when we're talking about it being more accessible, we're talking about safe access, because it is very unique in the sense that it does cause this ataxia. It does have, it could potentially have cardiotoxic interactions if there's not proper screening. And then the demographic that it's being used for, the situation it's being used in. It's not just you're going to take some mushrooms out with some friends at a camping. It's these people are coming because usually it's a last resort, like rehab or anything. It's usually a life or death situation for these people, So that's something to really keep in mind as well, is we're working with a really fragile demographic that we really want to optimize and the chance of success, and for the whole movement at large, So yeah, man, we've had such a fascinating conversation. I look forward to always speaking with you. I always like to give my guests the last word, a message that you want to share with people. I would love for you to just share that, and maybe to the still suffering addict out there, that's thinking about doing Iboga. What is your message to them?
Oh, yeah, there is hope. Especially if you're hooked up on an opioid, OxyContin, buprenorphine, methadone. I have been fortunate in my life that I have not become addicted to these things, but I completely have compassion for where you are and how hopeless and how dark the days might seem. I hope I haven't oversold Ibogaine here, but it will release you from the chemical handcuffs of your situation. It is possible at the moment to choose wisely among the Mexican clinic scenes ahead of full medicalization in Canada. Just if you are looking online, make sure that you do good due diligence and that you get to possibly speak to people that have been to the same establishment. The more general last word I'd have, Gaurav, is Ibogaine's time has come. People do disparage it, rival psychedelic companies, and I understand that because they're promoting their interests. But in a medical context, it's perfectly safe. It's the only way you're going to get off your opioid addiction or your opiate addiction, and its time has come. And well, mark my words, maybe somebody uncovers this in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, and we will have seen to have been right that by the end of this decade, widespread Ibogaine provision will be available across the planet.
That's a really bright and exciting future, and one I certainly look forward to. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on the show. For the people that are interested in connecting with you, where can they find you on social media or your website? It'd be great if you can just share that.
Yeah, universalibogaine.inc, INC for the company, and Jeremy Weate on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody. This is another episode of the PsyFi podcast, where we interview leading industry experts, clinicians, scientists, and researchers to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic science. Thank you so much to Dr. Jeremy Weate of Universal Ibogaine for coming on the show, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thanks for joining the PsyFi series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.